Welcome to Polaris Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion in our series focused on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in collaboration with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. If you have questions for today's guest, please feel free to submit them using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. After the live event, you can also listen to these programs on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for being part of this global conversation. Latin America today sits at the center of the most consequential global questions of our time: how countries pursue economic growth, protect their environment, preserve policy sovereignty in a world no longer dominated by a single power. As the United States tightens trade policy and China deepens its economic presence across the region, governments from Peru to Brazil are being asked, sometimes pressured, to make choices that will shape their development path for decades. Few scholars understand these pressures as clearly and realistically as my guest today, Cynthia Sanborn, globally recognized expert on US-Latin American relations, political economy, and environmental governance. She is professor at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru, and a senior researcher at its Research Center, CIUP. She has also been affiliated with leading international institutions, including Harvard University's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and the Wilson Center in Washington. Her work focuses not on abstract ideals, but on how real governments, especially in Latin America, balance development, democracy, and environmental responsibility under intense economic and geopolitical constraints. At a moment when even advanced economies like Canada are reconsidering environmental commitments in response to trade and economic shocks, Cynthia's perspective is vital to understand whether and how Latin America can chart a more autonomous path or confront harder trade-offs in a more unforgiving polar world. Welcome to Polaris Live, Professor Sanborn. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Sarwar, and thank you for inviting me to this fantastic platform.
Listen, given the scale of Chinese investment and Washington's renewed strategic focus on the region, how much real space do you really think Latin American governments still have to defend their own development priorities and environmental rules, Dr. Sanborn?
Well, I think they have significant space and they need to maintain that space because unlike some decades ago, for most of South America especially, China now has a very dense and large economic presence. And many of us have China as our major market, the major market for our commodities, an important source of FDI, as is the United States. And I think that most Latin American countries need to steer a path in which they get the both of them and hopefully benefit from the competition as well. But it's a different ballgame now than it was in a mid to late 20th century, even when the U.S. was so dominant in this region and China was barely known.
Is it a different ballgame also, though, because of the changing political environment in your neck of the woods, as they say? There's a recent swing to right-of-center governments in many Latin American countries, and including Ecuador and recently Chile. What's happening here?
Well, we see, this region has a pendulum situation. Chile being an excellent example of every time they elect someone on the right, dissatisfaction sets in and they elect someone on the left. And, they go back and forth. And I think one issue that's really important in understanding the context today is that in the economic sphere, even when pro-U.S., perhaps even critical governments towards China are elected, The level of economic integration, the level of relationships is such that we really need both. So two governments in the region really are backing away with engagement with China. And I think countries like ours, like Peru, like Chile, that are mineral exporters, China's our major market by far. In energy, China is one of their leading investors. So even though we may ally with the U.S. on a number of issues, and the U.S. market is very important, China is too important to try and back away from at this point.
Would you say that that balancing act you just described, which is quite admirable actually, continues to work under the new administration's rules in America?
Well, it's early. It's been just a year. And I think there's a number of things to be tested. You know, there was the initial measures that came, the trade measures that came out of the U.S. administration that I think shocked a lot of people in this region, and particularly countries like ours that had a free trade agreement negotiated with the United States, and we're quite surprised to have tariffs slapped on our exports after negotiating that in good faith. But there's been ups and downs, as we see. I think now we're in a period, the context now is interesting because in the last 10 days, the United States has emitted a new national security strategy,
right,
in which Latin America and the Western Hemisphere features prominently. And China last week produced a new Latin American working paper, the third one this century. And so we actually have now more written declarations. They may be declarative, but both sides are also giving more explicit emphasis to how they see Latin America and what we might expect from them. And the contrasts could not be more dramatic, actually, between them.
Well, that makes both of them worth reading. But do you think this increased insight from the two superpowers, if I may call them that, does it delight people in Latin America? Does it make them concerned? Are they proud that they're all of a sudden being on a pedestal by both? Just trying to get a feeling from you for the atmospherics.
Well, I think it depends if you're in Venezuela or if you're in Brazil or if you're in Chile, of course. Your situation might be different. I think there's a sense that Latin America is recognized certainly as a commodity exporter, but now with the concerns about global energy transition, the critical mineral discourse, Latin America has all of the major minerals needed for the energy transition. Latin America is also vital to global concerns for food security. We're a food basket for much of the world in what we produce. But also Latin American countries, we have significant middle class and urban populations that demand a lot of things that both the US and China provide. So I think, yes, there's a sense of being renewed attention, especially from the United States, because the attention from China has been there since the early 21st century. This kind of renewed look from the United States is of interest. At the same time, the US strategy is framed not in terms of development cooperation, as it has been historically, certainly not in terms of democracy and human rights or other values. The US strategy is framed in terms of seeing the region as a strategic concern, even a threat. And I think that is something that concerns people in this region. Right?
Well, I'm sure some of that has to do with the increased amount of Chinese interest and investment that is flowing. But I think you make a good point that it behooves us at least to read the executive summaries, if we can, of both reports. But let me switch, Cynthia, if I may, to Southeast Asian model. I mean, the countries there decided that they weren't going to be able to really grapple with this powerhouse just next door to them, i.e. China. And they came up with a grouping, now 11 countries, the Association of East Asian Nations. And we had the ambassador from Malaysia yesterday on Polaris-Live, who Malaysia chaired, was the chair for a year, just stepped down of ASEAN. And he said that that model really helps them to integrate the countries in Southeast Asia and to keep regional institutions such as ASEAN cohesive, even among the now increasing great power rivalry. Is Latin America in the frame of thinking of an association of countries? I know it's a very different part of the region, much more independent-minded, so to say. But have you thought about this at all? That is there an ASEAN model that would work in Latin America?
Oh, I've thought about it a lot, and I've been recently involved with ambassadors from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and others, because Southeast Asian countries are reaching out to Latin America as well recently, and it's quite fascinating for us. It was very impressive for me to see the interview with His Excellency Mohammed Shahrul Ikram, to hear about their leadership in ASEAN and how they've managed to maintain strategic autonomy despite being clearly in the sphere of influence of China and despite having a very significant Chinese population of their own. And it's admirable, and I think we can learn from it. But I've been racking my brain to think, well, why is it that regional integration efforts in Latin America, practical ones that work, have usually not worked? We have a lot of lip service paid to different, there's the CELAC Latin America Forum, where ministers from Latin America meet with heads of state of China once every so often. We have the Pacific Alliance, which used to be 4 like-minded countries, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, with the common economic models. That doesn't work anymore. And I think there's just a lot more challenges. Latin American countries have been successfully hedging, most of them have been successfully hedging in their relations with China and the United States, also with Europe. But they've been hedging bilaterally, they've been hedging alone. And Brazil is big enough to do it as a member of the BRICS. Peru and Chile have to do it because we need both China and the US for markets and for investment. But we would do it a lot more effectively. We'd perhaps negotiate better if we were in some kind of association like ASEAN, and we simply are not. And the factors that lead to that, I mean, one could go back to history. The Southeast Asia was hit very hard in World War II. Southeast Asia had a lot of motivation to join together historically to try and avoid those kind of conflicts in the past. Latin America didn't have that experience. We also have a much more unstable political terrain. As we mentioned earlier, we swing to the right, we swing to the left, and unfortunately, ideology gets in the way of practical association around issues that are clearly of common interest. We also export a lot of the same things and don't trade much with each other. And I think ASEAN trades a lot more internally than we do in Latin America. So there's been a lot of factors that have gotten in the way. There's a recognition of the need to. There's been some efforts, especially by the Economic Commission of Latin America, the UN, the CEPAL, ECLAC institution, a lot of reflection. But, politics gets in the way. And as we see now with these electoral swings, it may well be that, once again, each country tries to negotiate on its own.
So, Cynthia, let me ask you, I want to bring to center stage Canada and the experience they've had recently. I mean, 87 to 89% of Canada's trade, income, GDP derives from its almost friendship, allied relationship with the United States. It's something that Canadians never thought would end. Well, it ended with a bang, and now Canada is facing what they think is going to be a few years of real turmoil till they figure out how to diversify their business, their trade. And I bring that up only because of what you just said about the many of the Latin American countries who have their own trade relationships with America, have had them for generations, and is some of the same thinking as Canada's part of it, that, gee, this is so nice. They're right a few 100,000, not 100,000, a few 100 miles, some a few thousand miles. What could be easier than just carrying on this trade forever? Why do we have to worry about integration of our region? Why do we have to worry about diversifying in some way? Does Canada give some pause to strategic thinking in Latin America?
Very good question. I don't know about Canada, because our relations with Canada are very different than Canada's relations with the U.S.
I was thinking more about the tightness and the longevity and the supposed permanence of the relationship.
I think that really varies across this region. That's where the diversity of the region comes in. I mean, if you look at Mexico, Central America, even Colombia, they're very tightly dependent on and related to the US market. And I think for Mexico and Colombia, the challenges are much bigger because they really have needed the US. The relationship with China is much different. The US is really their major partner, and in many ways. Those of us in South America, both Brazil and the Western South America, while the US is a major market, China has long been as well. And those of us that are mineral exporters, China got out ahead of the game in terms of critical minerals, in terms of accessing, both through FDI and through markets, accessing copper, lithium, iron ore, a number of things, rare earths that we have. And our relationships are pretty tight there. Now, the US is kind of racing to get ahead in there. And I think that probably favors us if we play the cards right. And again, if we could negotiate more as a region, that would probably add more value to what we are able to do. But I think that it's different in the sense that the level of dependence we've had on the US economically has diminished considerably in the last few decades. What I think is distinct is that the US, what many like to call soft power, the cultural power of the US, the identification with this common set of values, the wanting to study in the United States, the tourist industry, all of that has been much stronger in Latin America and South America than China, right? We don't consume a lot of Chinese cultural products, although they're coming more frequently. China's not a huge demand for tourism from Latin America. It's really an economic relationship. And the fact that in some cases there's more hostility and more difficulty with the United States, particularly around immigration, visa issues, I think has been a wake-up call to some in this region. Although I think still most of the countries on our side of the Pacific are trying to play their cards, as you said, with both. Realizing that there's an interest from both sides in what we have, and if we can play our cards right, it will be to our benefit. And, you know, if the U.S., I think the U.S. is right now showing a tremendous military buildup in the Caribbean and trying to pressure for regime change in Venezuela, and that's controversial, I know.
Yes.
But in South America, I mean, the relationship with Brazil has been interesting. The government of Brazil has negotiated quite effectively and has responded to some initial trade aggression and have apparently reached some terms that are more beneficial. Chile and Peru both have very recent negotiations, discussions with the U.S. about the possibility of the U.S. government facilitating investment in our region as well, in our countries. So the jury is out on the relationship with the U.S. I must say that China is not pressuring us to back away from the United States. China has never played that role. China's presence is really economic, whereas the U.S. has been pressuring some countries to back away from at least new investment from China.
Well, it's interesting. I listened some months ago, actually, to a series of security seminars from military folks from China, and they almost seem to say, and this is now in regards to the Middle East, is that we just want to focus on increasing the use of the renminbi. We want to continue to build our relationship, banking centers, and so on. But as far as security is concerned, we are very happy to let America take care of that, because then we don't, really have to spend the money on it. Is some of the same thinking going on there where you are?
Well, it's funny. When I started to do research and started to do policy advising on China and Latin America, when I would travel to China, initially Chinese colleagues, Chinese academics would call us the backyard of the United States, would consider that we were part of the sphere of influence of the United States and that was natural. And for many of us, Latin Americans had to say, no, we are autonomous sovereign nations. We're nobody's backyard. We're nobody's property. And you should see us as, it's asymmetric, but see us as sovereign nations. That's changed quite a lot. And that's changed in Chinese academic culture as well. You see more and more scholars looking at Latin America as independent countries and rethinking that idea that somehow we're all dependent on the United States. And I think that's changed considerably. But I do agree. And I think if you look at China's behavior in the region, they're not looking to assume more responsibilities, particularly not political or military. There's been some concern in the US about Chinese investment in infrastructure in Latin America, of course. But nothing indicates that they want to have any kind of big security presence in the region. Quite the contrary. And I think the U.S. perhaps errs in its level of concern about that. I understand where that's coming from, but I think really the best role the U.S. can play is to compete on fair ground with more investment and more development type of collaboration. A lot of that was cut recently, for example.
Fascinating. Let me please take a moment to remind viewers that Polaris-Live is commercial-free, entirely viewer-supported. We'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com and becoming a subscriber by going to the same website, kashmeri.com. As a subscriber, you will automatically receive a curated one-page executive summary of each Polaris-Live program, which will be directly mailed to your inbox. We always welcome your comments on our video and our podcast channel. So, Cynthia, you are also, I don't know where you get the time to do all these things that you do. I mean, this would take a whole group of faculty members to, but you're also director of the China Asia Pacific Center. And I want to switch, if you don't mind, to the port of Chancay. I mean, this is, you get the impression in America that this is one of the biggest developments on the Pacific coast ports in Latin America, but there's also a group that says, this is a huge mistake, and this is part of the debt trap diplomacy of China, meaning they lend so much easy money that the countries that get it are not able to pay them back. When they can't pay them back, they come and take over whatever help they've given to develop the asset. I mean, Chancay, from my understanding, is a major development, not just for Peru and the region. And I'd like to spend the remainder of my time, if you don't mind, by just talking about that. But please start with the idea of hearts and minds. Do you see this as part of China's hearts and minds winning strategy?
Well, it's not an easy answer because, the Chancay port, which is the largest deep water automatic modern port in Western South America now, and it's been just a year since it was inaugurated. It started out as a dream of a bunch of retired Navy officers, a bunch of retired Navy guys from Peru. This was a Peruvian dream.
Wow.
And they got more than lucky when they went out looking for foreign investors. They ended up with COSCO Shipping, which is one of the largest companies in the world in this business. So, of course, they really overshot in a big way. But the idea of having this port and the idea of being a maritime hub for all of Western South America was something that Peruvians had as a dream many years ago. And we've been following it at our university. We have a whole observatory about it. I think it's important to clarify that. The second thing that's important to clarify is that there's no debt trap. This is not debt. This is a private investment in the sense that it's 60% COSCO Shipping. It's 40% Volcan. It's a Peruvian company with shareholders from different places. And there's no debt. In fact, Peru is a country that does not have major debt with China. We have no government-to-government projects with China. Chile is similar in that sense. We really try to keep it on market factors. And the port is showing within its first year that it's had quite solid results in terms of trade both ways. It's reduced the shipping time from Western South America to China dramatically. It's facilitated not only Peruvian exports to Asia, but also feeder traffic from Chile, from Colombia, from Ecuador, from Mexico. And I discovered, looking at the data, that we've even been shipping blueberries to the United States from the Chancay port, which is quite an interesting surprise. That said, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is a major branding exercise for China. Of course, slapping the BRI brand on this project. And as I said, this project began as a Peruvian project. COSCO came in. COSCO is the dominant shareholder. Obviously, it's very important. But this is not something that was born in China. And I think China's benefited from it to the extent they've been able to say, look what China can do. And when it was inaugurated in the APEC forum a year ago here in Lima, Xi Jinping inaugurated it. It was a huge PR boost for China in this region. And, Joseph Biden was there, and he was a president on his way out. So we didn't have a lot to compete at the time with China during that event. but it's been very positive for China. Now, China doesn't have a bad public opinion here beforehand. Peru is a country that's always had a fairly favorable public opinion. But 70%, I was looking at recent data, 77% of Peruvians have a very favorable opinion of this port. Majority of Peruvians see it as a major benefit for our economy. It's a big deal. And yes, Peruvians associate it now with China.
And from what you say, you've seen numbers that say during the first year, the port is actually starting to become a commercial success.
Yeah, it's got two. It has a dual role. It's a transshipment. It's Transpacific bridge between South America and Asia, China, but not only China, but also it's a regional trading hub in which feeder ships can come from other countries and then load onto larger ships in this port, which is much deeper, and get their stuff faster to China as well. And actually, in the first year, 45% of the cargo has been feeder ships. It's been transshipment from other countries in the region. So it's not a solely Peruvian project. It's really a regional shipping hub. And, it's not the number one port in Peru within a year. We still have a very large port in Callao, and we have several other ports as well. But it's been significant. And for Peru, trade between Peru and Shanghai alone increased almost 60% in this first year. And that's through Chancay. And it's not traditional minerals. Our traditional minerals, our copper and our silver and our iron ore, go through other ports that have the capacity to be mineral ports. This is a port that's largely focused on commercial agriculture, shipping out blueberries, avocados, grapes, cherries, and things, and other kinds of products, fish meal as well. And it's also to some extent diversifying the trade. Now, the trade balance is, as we all know, asymmetric. We're shipping out blueberries and cherries, and we're getting electric vehicles and solar panels and low-cost, fantastic cell phones and those kind of things from China, of course. And Peruvians, as their neighbors, would like to export more value-added products. But we just last week put up for concession for bids a big industrial park plan near the Chancay port, the Ancon Industrial Park, and there were 4 bidders, and the Chinese bidders won. So there's now going to be a couple Chinese companies developing an industrial park near the port, in which the idea is to have more value-added industry that could be shipped out. We'll see. Right?
Cynthia, you remind me so much in this conversation of Johns Hopkins, Dr. Bragan, who runs the Africa Center and is the leading go-to person on Chinese loans to Africa, because the same kind of fright and issues of debt diplomacy were raised when China was heavily investing in Africa. So what I want to ask you is, was America even on the playground competing for this business or like business in Peru, because it's so important now for hearts and minds, and it'll be very hard for America to recover? Did they make a big play to woo you guys?
The United States is very important in this region, but they're really in different spaces. The Chinese are investing in big infrastructure, both public and private. They're investing in energy, renewable energy, and the whole energy supply chain. In fact, they've bought up Western companies that have left our market. Power China has bought up from Sempra Energy in the United States and from Enel in Europe. So they're in energy, they're in infrastructure, ports and roads and other things, as well as in minerals. Now in minerals, everybody's here. All the Western multinationals are in our region as well, right? But the U.S. has been very important. For example, for Peru, the U.S. is our number one market for off-season fruits and vegetables. And although that sounds simple, in fact, the commercial agriculture employs a large number of people. It provides great jobs for young people without a lot of skills. It's been a real boon for this country. And, we tried to keep the U.S. market alive and happy. Now, if the U.S. tries to have more aggressive trade measures, we're going to end up shipping more of that to Asia. But so far, the U.S. remains an important market. What the U.S. has not been doing is bidding on and investing in big infrastructure that this region desperately needs. And, U.S. companies can't be told what to invest in. I mean, they're not state-owned enterprises. The Chinese have the advantage of their own development banks, their own commercial banks, and the government telling them go west, go south, right? Which doesn't mean they don't have a profit motive, but they have other motives as well. Whereas the U.S. companies, I mean, the U.S. is not going to build a port in Peru or Chile to compete with the Chinese. They're going to build a port if it's profitable, right? I think, however, that the current U.S. administration has paid attention to this, and rather than aggressive, actually under the previous U.S. administration, there was more aggressive criticism of the Chinese presence in infrastructure, including the Chancay port. I think the current U.S. administration may be more focused on trying to encourage and motivate private investment in the region. We'll see, right? That would be a win-win, as they say.
Well, it's such a pleasure, educational opportunity to talk to you. You are there, you're looking at this and providing some factual information. I wish we could just continue on this conversation, Dr. Sanborn, for much longer, but we've unfortunately run out of time. And before my producer pulls a plug on me, I want to say how glad we are you took the time. Thank you so very much for your thought-provoking perspective, and I do hope you'll come back and see us again.
Well, I thank you for paying attention to Latin America, and those of us who are in Latin America appreciate being seen as an important region, and one that might have some lessons for others as well as a lot to learn.
And you'll notice that we do not use the word backyard for Latin America. I hope that came through our conversation.
No, it's very insulting. We're nobody's property. We're 6,000, 7,000 kilometers away, and it's just old-fashioned terminology. So thank you for not using it.
Well, listen, thank you to you, and I want to thank our viewers from around the world with this conversation. Around the world. With this conversation, we close our 2025 programming. We'll return in February 2026 with a special focus on Asia and Latin America and the countries in those regions. So please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact on all the other countries that have to live in this world. Until then, let me wish all of you a very happy holidays and an enjoyable, restful period. Until then, in February, goodbye.